place for us to move into our message today. So last week, Mark asked the question, what was Jesus after the resurrection? You know, when we're talking about living as an Easter people, living in the resurrection and not in the tomb, what is it that we are really talking about? What is it that Jesus became when he came out of the tomb? And does that have any connection to our lives today? So this is a really good question, and I think there's a couple things for us to think about when we approach this question. The first thing is to look at the Bible and see what the Bible has to say. Now, as I was doing that this week, the first thing that really struck me is that this isn't actually a very big deal. It's not a big issue for the people in the Bible. The people who were writing the Gospels and writing those first letters, the epistles, that some of which were even written before the Gospels, this was not something that they spent a lot of time writing about. So the book of Mark doesn't even have anything after the resurrection at all. Now, there was a little bit that was added on to Mark that has a little bit of post-resurrection, but it's not part of the original Gospel. Matthew has about half a chapter of after the resurrection. Luke and John have about a chapter. There's about a chapter in the beginning of Acts. But if you think about it, the glorious resurrection of Jesus gets very little ink in the Bible. So why is that? What is going on here? I think when we look at this, we see that for the people of Jesus' time, for the disciples who got to see him after the resurrection itself, that moment of Jesus coming out of the tomb, of rising from the dead, was the heart of the matter. That was what mattered. That was the whole story. Jesus died a public death that everyone saw him die, and he came back to life. And that was what mattered. When you look at the first letters that are written, they are talking about Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus rose from the dead. They didn't really care about exactly what his form was or anything afterwards. He rose from the dead. And that's what mattered. Now, as we do read these little glimpses that we have of life after the resurrection, I think one of the things that stands out to us is that Jesus is showing a little bit more of his God side. We know that Jesus was fully human and fully God. But before the resurrection, Jesus really played more of the I'm your buddy, I'm your friend, I'm your teacher, I'm hanging out with you. I did a few interesting things here and there, made loaves and fishes to feed 5,000, I healed some people, I did bring Lazarus back from the dead, but those were small moments in a life of companionship with his followers. He was mostly a man before his death. But after the resurrection, we start getting these supernatural moments, these Star Trek beam me up Scotty moments where he's walking with the guys to Emmaus. They don't recognize him. They see him in the breaking of the bread when they eat together. And then poof, he disappears and then he shows up in Jerusalem. The passage we read in John today, the disciples are behind closed doors because they were afraid. Jesus came and stood among them. He didn't walk through the door. He just showed up. He was not there, and then he was there. God side. So we're seeing more of the divinity of Jesus. So what Jesus does in these 40 days from the resurrection to the ascension, where he goes back into heaven, he's really tying up loose ends. He's checking in with his friends, making sure people understand, doing a little bit more teaching. But Jesus really already has one foot in heaven. And he only has one foot at earth at that point. He's really living in that in-between space between earth and heaven. Now, this may have not been a huge issue for the people writing the New Testament. But it became a huge issue in the early days of the Christian church. And this was one of the great heresies, one of the great debates of the early church. What is the nature of Jesus Christ? And it became known as the Gnostic heresy. The Gnostics, spelled with G-N, Gnostics, they were a group of people that believed the Spirit was perfection, and that we needed to become more spiritual beings, and that Jesus wasn't really a man, he was a spirit who walked among us. Now, why is this important? Well, if he's just a spirit, then what meaning does his death have? Did he really conquer death if he was a spirit who couldn't really die? And so the early church affirmed in the creeds that we say that Jesus was fully human and fully divine. And the whole church came together and affirmed the Nicene Creed where that was said in the 300s. Now, all of that is interesting. And it's interesting to go through the theology and the church history. It's interesting to read the Bible to see what does it say and why things are just jumping around on my screen. But what does that have to do with us today? And I have to say that while I was doing this research this week and praying over this question that Mark had raised, the idea of resurrection seemed to be in the news a lot. How are we going to resurrect our economy? How do we restart? How do we reopen? When do we get to emerge from the tombs of our houses? Many of us are very lonely, very isolated, very bored, very scared, very anxious. We started seeing protests this week of people that don't like the stay-at-home orders of different states. We are truly starting to feel the tremendous economic pain of what has been happening in our country as we shut down in order to deal with this pandemic. This week I also started hearing some stories from people who have recovered from COVID-19. And I found these interesting because some of them even explicitly say they feel like they've been resurrected. Some of them felt like it could have gone either way. They felt that they were looking at death. But they also feel that their recovery is not what they expected. They have mental things. Someone said that their brain feels foggy. Some of them are feeling sorts of things that they didn't expect to feel. So whether we're talking about recovering from the virus or recovering our economy, we want to know what is going to happen. What will it be like? Now, one of the interesting things in the Jesus story is that these were not questions that the disciples were asking. Jesus died, and they expected him to stay dead. They did not expect him to rise from the dead. Yes, Jesus tried to give them some tips, some prophecy, some hints of what was going to happen. But none of them got it. None of them understood. I'm sure if I was back there, I would have missed it as well. And I'm guessing all of us are sitting here going, yeah, I would have missed it too. I would have been just like the disciples with no clue of what was going on. So they weren't looking for Jesus to be resurrected. They weren't asking these questions. So that's a difference between what happened then and what happened now. But I think there's a lot of questions that we're asking. This week, as I was roaming around the internet, trying to figure out what was going on and what was going to happen and how things were going to, what impacts there might be, I came across this report that was written and published by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis in 2007. And they had gone back and done all the economic and public health research that they could do on the 1918 pandemic to then figure out what would happen to the U.S. economy today if we had a pandemic like this. Now, this was written in 2007, but frankly, it sounds like it could have been written last week. And it was really interesting to read this because one of the things that they determined as their analysis was that the cities that had a fast response and a long response, they were on lockdown, they were on shelter in place sorts of things, quickly and for a long period of time, that after the pandemic, they actually had stronger economies than the places that did less for a shorter period of time. And one of the things they came to say is that people dying is not good for your economy. That when people die, lots of them quickly, it is devastating to communities. Now, we as Christians don't need an economic report to tell us this. We know from our ethics as Christians that every life is precious and valuable, and that it is better to help people live than to let them die needless deaths. So reports like this are the ways that we try to figure out what is going to happen next. What is it going to look like after the pandemic? What are we going to do when we leave the tomb? Going back to Jesus, he was showing more of his God side, but there was a very real human side for his disciples to look at as well, and I don't understand why this keeps jumping ahead. We're still working out the technology here. But in this picture, which is a drawing from an artist in Africa, you can see Thomas going to Jesus to touch his side that has the cut in it, to touch his hands, to look at his feet, to see the physical marks of what Jesus went through on our behalf, because Jesus loved us enough to redeem every single one of us. The thing is, when we're looking at this picture and we think about the doubting Thomas, we are Thomas so often. We don't know what to look for. We don't even know if we should be looking. In all the questions we're asking about what is the resurrection we may feel in our communities, we may think we have all the questions, but God has a bigger plan, which is the second point for this. First was we don't know what to look for. Second is God has a plan. This photo is from a seminary in Hong Kong, and it shows us that God's plan is so much bigger than any of us can think. Who would have thought that the Christian faith would make it to Hong Kong and we would have this beautiful mural of the mother of Jesus and Jesus in this beautiful picture that reminds us of how the Spirit works and the joy of creation, the promise of Noah's rainbow, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. God's plan is bigger, just as one of you said during our reflection time. It goes so far beyond what we even think to ask or don't even know to ask. He has a plan, it's bigger than us. Humans have been through this before, and we have made it to the other side. There were plagues and pestilence in Bible times. There have been plagues and pestilence throughout human history. And we have found ways to survive and even to thrive when we come together as a community. The final thing that I think we learn from Jesus' resurrection is that Jesus is going to be with us all the way through. So we don't always know what to look for. God has a plan, and God will be with us. Jesus came back to comfort his disciples. Jesus is here with us today to comfort us. Some of us are comforted through our relationships with our friends here. Some of us are comforted through watching videos to learn more about God. Some of us are comforted by studying our Bibles and through spending time in prayer with God. Our reading in John today also reminds us of the beginning of John, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word," and the Word is Jesus. Jesus was there in the beginning. Jesus was there in the tomb. Jesus is there at the resurrection. Jesus will always be with us. Even after these 40 days that Jesus is hanging out with everyone after his resurrection and before his ascension to heaven, he is comforting people, teaching them, preparing them to be able to continue to build a faith community after he returns to heaven. But even though Jesus has returned to heaven, he comes back and shows up. He showed up on a road when Paul was on his way to Damascus to harass and persecute early believers. He showed up to Peter at different times. He showed up to Mother of Teresa. He has shown up to Julian of Norwich. He has shown up to faithful believers through the centuries. And this week, he has shown up to some of our people. And I know this coming week, we will know God's presence again. And we will hear those stories next week. So the heart of our matter is that Jesus is resurrected. He is fully human. He is fully God. We know that he knows what we're going through. He knows our pain. He knows our anxiety. And he is willing to walk with us every step of the way. So during this time that we are socially isolated, I think there are some things we can do to make sure that we are with God when God is with us. This is a time for us to intentionally come to know God better, perhaps through Bible study or our video study that will start again today, Bible study Wednesday night, reading on your own, studying at home. It's a time to love God more. We can do that through praying. We can do that through praising God in our worship time together. And it is a time for us to intentionally serve God by serving our neighbors. This morning, I got a text from my daughter very early in the morning. And this is a website from Singapore. Of course, they're 13 hours ahead of us. One of my daughter's friends works for the city of the nation state of Singapore, one of her college friends. And this website actually is an online giving site run by a coalition of charities. So there's one place for you to give to all the charities in Singapore. This particular charity is the Methodist Welfare Services. And Singapore, like our country, has been sending money, stimulus checks, relief checks out to the people of their city. And the Methodist Welfare Services has been encouraging the people who are comfortable to be able to donate their stimulus checks to their neighbors who are struggling. So this is one thing the Methodists are doing in Singapore to serve God and serve their neighbor during these difficult times. I also read an article this week from our own General Board of Global Ministries talking about how so many U.S. churches are really focused on short-term mission trips. And this time of pandemic is a great time for us to reconsider how we do missions with other believers around the world and how we serve people. And this is the website, umcmission.org, for our Global Ministries program. And it's a way that we can see what people are doing around the world when we can't go travel. And this is also a place where we can look and see perhaps there is a ministry that maybe we can support with some finances, or we can support with our prayers and by building a relationship with them where they can be praying for our ministry here while we help pray for their ministry there. And there could be wonderful ways that we can actually build stronger relationships because of this time. And we need to make sure we don't forget all of our companions in the Methodist family who are serving their communities around the world. So as we go forward this week, we are an Easter people. We are living in the resurrection. And we may have one set of questions about the resurrection of our life today. We may have another set of questions about the resurrection of Jesus. But in both cases, God is with us. God has a plan. And it doesn't matter if we know what to look for, or if we're confused, or if we just don't get what's happening. God is with us, and God has a plan. Let us pray. Redeemer and sustaining God, we thank you that you have given us this opportunity to be together in difficult times. Open our hearts and our hands that we can see the ways that each one of us is being called to serve our neighbors during these difficult days. Open our minds to know you better. Open our hearts to love you more. We desire you, God, in our lives. We desire your peace and your comfort, but we also desire your sustaining energy that we can share with our neighbors, no matter what struggles they are facing. So give us strength and courage to go this week to serve you and serve our neighbor. In your name we pray. Amen.